The United States of America commenced hostilities against Iraq on March 19, 2003. One aspect of those hostilities was the invasion and occupation of Fallujah, a city of nearly 250,000 people in the Al-Anbar province of Iraq. The occupation of Fallujah nearly from the outset was plagued by insurgency, civil unrest, and resistance. Demonstrations broke down into violence, much of the city was destroyed, and the use of a controversial weapon, white phosphorus, further eroded the U.S.'s moral credentials during the occupation. Because of the use of this weapon, and because of the purportedly harsh tactics of the United States military, allegations of genocide were lodged against the U.S. by a number of small media outlets. In this paper, I aim to take up those allegations and evaluate their legitimacy. In the first part of this paper, I will establish that white phosphorus was used in Fallujah, which is itself no easy task. In the second part, I will say why this raises concerns about genocide during the U.S. occupation. However, as I will argue there, the nature of white phosphorus as an indiscriminate weapon seems to preclude the application of the label genocide, because genocide by its nature is an intentional action. I will discuss a number of contingent possibilities that would strengthen the allegations of genocide and argue that they likely did not obtain. In the third part, I will examine where we are left as responsible critics of war in general and disengagement in particular. Finally, Pentagon spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Barry Venable admitted that white phosphorus was used in Iraq as, quote, fire at the enemy, unquote, and, quote, directly against Iraqi insurgents, unquote. The New York Times quoted Venable as saying, quote, it's perfectly legitimate to use this stuff against enemy combatants, unquote. That contention is problematic for a number of reasons I will discuss in the last section of this paper. However, as we will see, Venable's statement was not enough to quiet accusations of genocide spurred by revelations about the use of white phosphorus. The articles that I cited above, which I actually skipped in this presentation, present numerous eyewitness accounts from both sides of the battle that heavily imply that white phosphorus was used indiscriminately and that civilians were casualties. As far as the United States is concerned, they would certainly prefer that it were the case that white phosphorus was not used against civilians, but was used proportionately, discriminately, and solely against confirmed insurgents. The likelihood is low that all three of these conditions were satisfied, simply because of the nature of urban, nighttime guerrilla warfare. It's likely instead that the United States was acting objectionably with its indirect artillery fire. The allegation of genocide is perhaps the most serious allegation that can be lodged against a country in a time of war. Since the creation of the term by the UN's Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the word has been used sparingly by serious authorities. This is likely because to acknowledge the occurrence of genocide legally binds a nation to take preventative action under the UN Convention and the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. It is also likely because genuine genocide, as defined by the UN Convention, is a rare thing. Article 2 of the UN's Genocide Convention defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, etc., etc. I'm going to skip the irrelevant criteria. The term genocide was used in reference to Iraq not long after the invasion. The Independent, a left-leaning British newspaper, published one such article. That article contained the testimony of an ex-Marine who said that he was distraught by the number of innocent civilians being killed in Iraq. Quote, finally, however, he voiced his own doubts to his commanding officer, and this is quoting the Marine now. I told him I felt like we were committing genocide in Iraq, that we were doing harm to a culture. He said nothing and walked away. I knew my career was over, unquote. Additionally, articles on RememberFallujah.com, Countercurrents.org, and Atlantic Free Press reported stories of Iraqi civilians alleging genocide. A blog dedicated to the topic was established at FallujahGenocide.blogspot.com. A search for Fallujah genocide on Google returns over 1 million web pages. While the claims seem limited to the fringes of the debate, they merit discussion for their serious character and implications. According to the account previously quoted, such a cloud can have an effective range of 150 meters or nearly 500 feet. It should be apparent then that people are not discreetly targeted with white phosphorus in any sense, for it cannot be reasonably believed that one can individuate targets from a distance and guarantee that specific individuals will be affected by firing white phosphorus rounds. It is this reasoning that leads me to the paradoxical conclusion that it is precisely white phosphorus's indiscriminate character that both raises concerns over genocide and precludes its use as constituting genocide. The fact that many people are indiscriminately killed leads to mass casualties, which in turn, combined with the taboo chemical nature of white phosphorus, leads many to cry out with the most powerful moral declaration at their disposal: genocide. But it is because no one can be effectively targeted with white phosphorus on the basis of ethnicity, religion, etc., that negates any genocidal fears. Only intentional, deliberate actions, and especially those that are part of a larger orchestrated campaign, are vulnerable to the charge of genocide. Because the United States' use of white phosphorus in Fallujah could not have been employed to intentionally destroy, in whole or in part, a specific group, it was not genocidal. The stubborn critic, he who clings to the allegation of genocide, can imagine scenarios in which that label might stick. These situations I find unlikely, but I will take time to dispel them now. For example, though white phosphorus is indiscriminate, it might be that firing into a large group of people who had previously been singled out for their religion, ethnicity, etc. would accomplish something nearing genocide. For example, Zyklon B is likely an indiscriminate weapon. Likewise an indiscriminate weapon. But when it was deployed against confined populations that had been pre-screened and segregated because of their religion. No one doubts that because Zyklon B is indiscriminate, the Nazis were not committing genocide. However, I fervently believe that the circumstances of the deployment of white phosphorus in Fallujah were fundamentally different from that of Nazi extermination camps. At best, being the absolute most generous to the critic, it might be contingently true that exclusively members of some ethnicity were killed. However, those victims were not killed because of their ethnicity per se, but because they were resistance fighters or located near what were thought to be resistance fighters. Certainly, the United States cannot happen to commit genocide. It is necessarily a deliberate action. Genocide was a word that was created purposefully to refer to these actions that shock the conscience of humanity. And the idea is, yes, those actions are deplorable, and they're attended, like I said, by a definition that is applied accordingly sparsely. I think we need to be extremely careful when we're throwing that word around, simply because it was designed purposefully to refer to, like I said, the worst things that can be done. And if the word is being used seriously, and if the allegations are accurate and correct, then it really does place great demands on mankind to act, to intervene. Absent that, it dilutes its meaning, and it's dangerous to throw it around all willy-nilly, just like it was, it meant simply a war crime or something like that. It's a war crime, but it's something much more above and beyond just a war crime. I certainly think it's the case. We have this fallacy that we joke about in philosophy that's called an appeal to Hitler. And the idea is, if you appeal to Hitler in your argument, it's probably because you don't have any other good reasons. I mean, if you're comparing something to Hitler or comparing something to Nazism, it's probably because you can't make much of an argument on the merits. So during the Bush administration, people were throwing around the word fascist. During the Obama administration, people are currently throwing around the word socialist without really knowing what it means. I think that's hugely dangerous. I think there are words that become sort of bad words without content, right? They don't have extensions in the world. They're empty signifiers. I think it would be a terrible, terrible thing if that happened with genocide, because, as I said, the word was created. It was crafted to capture one specific category of actions. So when it's being used to describe things other than that, it's bad for the word, if that makes sense. It's bad for international affairs and politics. It's bad for discussion. I'm not really sure. There are certainly problems with the structure of the United Nations and its governance, and there's also a certain timidity when it comes to facing up to moral problems in the world. And we have something like a genocide going on, and everyone just sort of looks the other way because no one has the political will to commit the troops to stop it. So I'm not sure if it's a problem with the definition of genocide, if it's a problem with the Security Council, or if it's a problem with weak-willed political leaders around the world over, because it certainly is not just a problem with the United States. But I think probably all of those elements are to blame. It would do good to change the definition. It would do very much good to reform the structure of the United Nations, and it would do good for the world to actually stand up when there's something going wrong, because we seem to fail over and over again when there's something that merits intervention.